Most people believe that when a narcissist encounters you again after a long stretch of silence, they will either completely ignore your presence, walk past you like a stranger, or quietly pretend that nothing serious ever existed between the two of you. That belief feels reasonable on the surface, and it feels like the obvious reaction any normal person might quietly expect. But something far more revealing actually happens in those critical first few seconds of contact. Something almost nobody talks about openly. Stay with me here, because what you are about to learn is one of the most misunderstood parts of how a narcissist truly operates behind their calm public mask. To a narcissist, you were never simply another person sharing ordinary space inside their carefully curated life. You were not just a friend, a partner, a coworker, or a loving family member who came and went. You were a mirror. You were a living, breathing, psychological reflective surface that constantly validated their sense of importance, sustained their feeling of control, and reinforced the specific image of who they firmly believe themselves to be deep down inside. Without that mirror standing in front of them every single day, their entire inner world begins to wobble quietly in the background, like a tall picture frame hammered into soft, crumbling drywall. When that mirror suddenly vanishes from their daily view for several months, or even years, a deeply unsettling process begins to take place deep inside their private psyche. The ideal version of themselves that they once saw clearly reflected through your eyes gradually starts to dissolve, like sugar dropped into warm water. Polished image they counted on, the one that quietly told them they were special, powerful, important, and utterly unforgettable. That carefully maintained image begins to fade in slow motion into something far less certain and far less flattering. Therefore, when the narcissist unexpectedly runs into you again after all that silent time has quietly passed, their mind does not react the way a healthy, emotionally mature person would react in that exact moment. They do not simply smile warmly and quietly, say that it is genuinely nice to see you again. They do not casually acknowledge your existence and move on with their day. Instead, their brain immediately initiates a subtle, silent, and highly strategic evaluation routine that began before they had even finished fully recognizing your face across the room. We are going to explore precisely what really happens during that initial moment of contact between two people who once mattered deeply to each other in their daily lives. Why does prolonged silence deeply destabilize a narcissist's internal reality far more than any loud public argument ever could possibly destabilize it? And what is the very specific instinctual reaction they almost always display when they suddenly realize they no longer quietly govern the reflection they once relied upon to confirm who they really are? This next part is the one most people completely miss, so listen closely. To fully grasp what actually transpires in that brief, loaded interaction, we have to examine a core insight that behavioral researchers have repeatedly emphasized over many decades of careful observation. Human beings do not relate to one another solely as external individuals standing face to face in ordinary physical space. They relate to the internal mental images and silent projections they quietly carry of those individuals deep within their own private psyche. There is one truly unique type of silence that exists between two people who once possessed a deep, shared intimacy in their lives. It is fundamentally different from the ordinary silence shared between strangers passing each other on a busy subway platform. Strangers carry absolutely no lingering history in the air between them. There is no emotional weight hanging quietly overhead. There are no unresolved memories demanding immediate, urgent attention from either party. Yet, when a narcissist encounters you again, after an extended absence filled with nothing but quiet, the entire atmosphere between you suddenly becomes heavy with everything that never got spoken about and never got fully resolved between you during all those silent months and long years. During the period when you were close and emotionally engaged with them in their daily life, Every single reaction you provided them gave vital, irreplaceable feedback they could not get anywhere else from anyone else around them. Your quiet admiration gave them emotional fuel to keep moving forward with confidence. Your undivided attention gave them hard proof of their own personal importance in your world. Even your clearly visible emotional distress gave them a strange kind of quiet confirmation that they still held power over your inner emotional state. Each of these genuine, honest reactions served to validate a crucial hidden narrative that ran constantly in the deepest part of their private mind. Your reactions repeatedly reassured them that they were powerful and influential by nature. They reassured the narcissist that they possessed an immense, almost magnetic influence over the people who got close enough to earn their focused attention. They reassured them that their mere physical presence in a room had the power to completely dictate another person's entire emotional state on demand. Over time, this constant, uninterrupted stream of external validation becomes deeply embedded within the healthier parts of their psyche, until it feels less like a luxury extra they sometimes enjoy, and far more like pure oxygen they cannot possibly live without from one moment to the next. As the years go by quietly, narcissists begin relying on specific, hand-picked individuals to act as permanent emotional anchors in their carefully curated daily lives. At first, when the long silence officially begins between you, the narcissist typically attempts to retain full control over the shared narrative they once wrote about the two of you together. They quietly construct a convenient internal story specifically designed to protect their fragile ego and preserve their sense of personal dominance in the story. They tell themselves that you were simply too emotional and unstable to handle their greatness. They tell themselves that you failed to appreciate their full value in the way you absolutely should have appreciated it. They tell themselves that you were easily replaced by someone objectively better suited for their ambitious needs. Researchers who study this behavior closely have long noticed the same repeated pattern showing up across countless cases. The narcissistic mind quietly excels at rewriting past events to preserve an unshakable sense of absolute superiority in every single chapter of their personal history. In their carefully edited fantasy version of reality, they never truly lost anything of real, lasting personal value. They simply chose, with calm, quiet dignity, to move on to bigger, brighter, and far better things in life. However, the relentless, unstoppable passage of long time has an undeniable way of wearing down even the most carefully manufactured internal narratives they construct. When months turn quietly into years, and the regular emotional feedback they once depended upon is no longer accessible in any form, the internal architecture quietly supporting their polished public persona begins to shift almost imperceptibly in directions they cannot easily control. Specialists have long described the public persona as a psychological mask that individuals wear in order to navigate ordinary society smoothly while keeping their deepest personal vulnerabilities hidden safely from public view. For an active narcissist, this polished persona is not just a casual social accessory they pick up before heading out the door. It is an incredibly fragile structural system that requires continuous external reinforcement from the people around them to remain standing fully upright. It cannot hold itself up alone under any circumstances. It needs constant validation quietly poured into it from outside sources just to remain recognizable and stable from one interaction to the next. When you ultimately stepped away from their life for good, one of the foundational mirrors keeping that polished persona upright quietly vanished along with you. The single primary support beam of their entire self-image disappeared, and the entire structure began to lean dangerously in directions they could not meaningfully predict or control. Initially, they may have sought to replace your presence without any delay. And this is precisely where their visible behavior becomes most telling to outside observers who are watching carefully. Narcissists frequently seek out fresh sources of external validation to fill the urgent emotional void your absence quietly left behind in their life. They quietly look for new individuals who will admire them on cue, listen to their carefully crafted stories with shining, approving eyes, or completely orient their entire emotional lives around the narcissist's always fluctuating personal needs. Hold on to this part because it explains a great deal about what you are about to see. This is precisely why so many narcissists seem to move into completely new relationships or new friendships with remarkable, almost suspicious speed after a previous emotional dynamic ends abruptly in their life. On the surface, this behavior closely resembles healthy emotional resilience, an admirable personal forward momentum through life. In truth, however, it is something far colder and far more calculated than genuine resilience. It is nothing more than psychological substitution, a quiet swap of one emotional mirror for a brand new replacement mirror they hope will reflect them just as clearly. Yet here is the small, important, often overlooked part the narcissist badly wants to quietly ignore forever. Psychological mirrors are not entirely interchangeable in their effects at all. Certain people reflect a far deeper, far more potent version of the narcissist's desired polished identity than others ever could possibly reflect back. Some connections possess a degree of emotional intensity and depth that proves extraordinarily difficult to duplicate, no matter how hard the narcissist tries over many long months of searching. Even when the narcissist successfully secures fresh attention somewhere else and begins a brand new emotional arrangement, a quiet part of the original reflection can linger stubbornly in the deep background of their private mind for many long years afterward. This residual lingering presence is not necessarily driven by genuine affection or warm longing for what once existed between you. Instead, it exists as an unresolved internal tension, an unanswered psychological question that quietly keeps surfacing at the worst possible moments. That hidden tension becomes critically active the exact moment your paths cross once again in ordinary physical space. When their eyes finally catch yours after a long period of total, unbroken silence, something truly extraordinary visibly happens inside their entire nervous system in real time. The former version of themselves that once existed vividly in your shared presence suddenly rushes back into their immediate awareness with startling, almost violent force. Within a tiny fraction of a single second, their active mind begins making an intense, rapid comparison between two very distinct internal images held carefully in their memory. The first image represents the polished self they remember being back when you were still actively orbiting their daily life. It is the charming, magnetic, larger-than-life public version they worked so hard to project outward toward everyone around them. The second image represents the self now standing physically before them in the present moment, entirely uncertain about what kind of reflection your calm, steady eyes will actually provide them today. This stark contrast creates an immediate, almost unbearable psychological pressure inside their chest that they cannot easily hide. If you choose to greet them with warm affection, laugh openly and easily at their familiar remarks, or instantly fall back into familiar patterns of emotional engagement from your shared past, that internal pressure vanishes just as fast as it quietly appeared in the first place. The old mirror has been successfully restored to its original upright position. Their carefully manufactured narrative of complete control over the situation remains perfectly intact for another comfortable season of their life. However, if your presence instead projects a fundamentally different emotional energy, such as calm emotional distance, quiet grounded confidence, or total honest indifference to their polished public performance, the pressure inside them spikes dramatically and almost painfully. In that fleeting second of contact between you, the narcissist comes to a startling and deeply uncomfortable personal realization. They recognize clearly that the dynamic between you has fundamentally shifted under their feet in ways they cannot easily reverse. And this immediate recognition triggers an instinctual response they almost always display without even realizing they are doing it in front of you. They immediately begin to scan you with focused attention. This scanning process is rarely loud or obvious to outside observers watching from a polite distance. It manifests through subtle micro behaviors and tiny physical shifts that most people miss entirely in any ordinary conversation. They closely observe the cadence, rhythm, and underlying emotional tone of your voice as you speak to them. They carefully measure the exact duration of your eye contact every single time you hold their gaze steady. They pay subtle, focused attention to whether your visible posture appears tight and visibly anxious, overly composed and artificially rehearsed for their benefit, or entirely unaffected by their close physical proximity to you at the moment. And here is the crucial, often misunderstood part of everything they are doing inside. They are not genuinely attempting to engage in a meaningful, heartfelt conversation with you in that critical opening moment of contact. They are actively hunting for concrete evidence. They are searching for hard, undeniable proof that the original psychological power balance between you still exists exactly as it once did during the heyday of your connection. Because the narcissistic mind relies so heavily on the emotional reactions of other people to measure its own ongoing personal worth in the world, your visible body language immediately becomes their primary indicator, their main scoreboard in real time as the conversation unfolds. If your overall demeanor suggests that you are still visibly affected by them in any small way whatsoever, their quiet inner confidence quickly returns to the polished surface, like an incoming tide rolling steadily toward the shore. To them, the old mirror between you is still functioning perfectly without any visible cracks. The historical power structure between you remains valid and fully operational in their private mind. Yet if your behavior clearly demonstrates that the emotional hold they once carefully maintained over you has completely evaporated into thin air, a far more complex and deeply uncomfortable psychological dynamic begins to unfold rapidly within them. This is precisely where the encounter quietly reaches its most fascinating, most telltale turning point in the conversation. When a narcissist comes face to face with someone who once reacted strongly and visibly to them, only to find that very same person now entirely neutral and emotionally unmoved, they encounter an uncomfortable reality their whole mind is uniquely unprepared to handle in any organized way. Genuine emotional neutrality quietly strips away the continuous validation they absolutely require in order to function comfortably in their daily social situations. It creates an emotional vacuum in which their carefully crafted public persona can no longer truly stabilize itself or maintain its familiar shape for any meaningful length of time. Researchers who study the inner workings of personality have long noted that uncomfortable, sudden moments like these force the individual psyche into an involuntary confrontation with its own deep hidden shadow. The shadow represents all the carefully hidden parts of ourselves that we actively refuse to acknowledge in any polished public setting. It includes the deep personal insecurities we quietly bury under confident-sounding public words, the buried character flaws we hide behind charming, practiced smiles, and the quiet emotional wounds we actively refuse to discuss with anyone we personally know. For an active narcissist, that hidden inner shadow is tightly packed with unaddressed feelings of deep, lingering personal inadequacy. It is filled with quiet, persistent fears of abandonment that never fully heal with the simple passage of time. It contains a profound emotional dependency on outside approval from others that stands in direct, embarrassing contradiction to the powerful, perfectly independent image they present to the outside world every single day. When your honest reaction fails to support their preferred polished public persona, the thin protective layer quietly separating their public image from their internal shadow begins to erode silently, almost like wet sand quietly washing away in a steadily rising tide. And the narcissist visibly experiences this deeply unsettling internal shift almost instantly in their body language. Even if they lack the basic self-awareness to express it clearly in spoken words, or even to fully recognize what is happening inside their own mind at that exact moment. That is exactly why the initial opening moments of any reunion following an extended period of silent separation are almost always charged with a subtle, palpable, almost electric tension that can be clearly felt by both people present in the space. You might feel it clearly in the sudden, sharp way their vocal tone shifts mid-sentence without any visible warning. You may observe it plainly in how deliberately they attempt to steer the conversation down a very specific path that quietly suits their hidden personal needs in the moment. Or you might notice it clearly in the way they become unusually attentive, leaning in slightly toward you, watching closely, as though they are carefully studying your every small movement with far more focused, almost clinical intensity than they ever did in the past. None of these small behavioral shifts are accidental or random in their timing at all. They all represent the mind's quiet, desperate attempt to regain its psychological orientation in a world that suddenly feels strangely unfamiliar to them. Because in that exact, unrepeatable moment of contact, the narcissist is not simply meeting up with you again for a casual, friendly chat between old acquaintances. They are actively confronting the deeply uncomfortable possibility that the mirror they once quietly depended upon to confirm who they are to themselves may no longer reflect their personal importance at all in any meaningful way. After that initial moment of sharp recognition quietly passes, a very subtle internal shift takes place deep within the narcissist's private mind. The encounter immediately ceases to be a simple, ordinary meeting between two people who once shared a complicated, emotionally heavy history. Within their private, hidden psyche, the conversation quickly transforms into a calculated, almost clinical evaluation of where they now actually stand with you. A narcissist rarely reacts in an impulsive, unplanned manner when their precious self-image is unmistakably on the line in front of them. Instead, their sharp mind immediately goes to work, gathering information with the precise focus of a quiet surgeon in an operating room. Before absolutely anything else visibly happens in the spoken conversation, they desperately want to determine one very specific thing. They need to figure out exactly what kind of psychological position they still quietly hold within your inner world today, after all that long, quiet time has passed between you. This single, invisible, unasked question quietly shapes every single word they choose to speak next in the conversation. This is precisely why that opening interaction can feel strangely analytical and distant to you, even when it is wrapped in polite, friendly-sounding small talk. They might offer a perfectly polite, rehearsed greeting, ask a casual surface question, or maintain an air of relaxed, easy indifference. But underneath that polished, charming exterior they present to the watching public, their inner focus becomes extraordinarily sharp and unusually alert to every tiny behavioral detail from you. They begin taking careful note of the microscopic behavioral details that most ordinary people completely overlook in any normal everyday conversation. They listen intently to the subtle variations in your vocal tone, actively searching for hidden feelings quietly buried underneath the literal words. They closely observe whether your physical posture stiffens, visibly relaxes, or stays perfectly neutral as they happen to step slightly closer to you in the space. They mentally measure the precise, exact pause it takes for you to respond to their opening remarks, counting the seconds almost without realizing they are actively doing it. None of this calculated observation happens by accident or by random chance in any small way. It is all part of an unspoken, quiet psychological test quietly unfolding in real time between two people who once knew each other extremely well. The narcissistic psyche relies heavily on the emotional reactions of other people as tangible, measurable proof of their ongoing personal influence over their immediate surroundings. The single strongest signal you can possibly send them is not open affection, and it is definitely not open personal resentment either. The single most powerful signal you can send is active emotional engagement of absolutely any small kind. If they quietly discover that they can still provoke a clear emotional reaction from you, whether that visible reaction is genuine admiration, mild irritation, quiet nostalgia, visible personal discomfort, or even mild annoyance at their familiar behavior, they instantly know their polished presence still carries immense psychological weight in your private world. That visible reaction, any small reaction at all, tells them the mirror between you is still quietly working and they still personally matter to you in some kind of meaningful way. Scholars who study close relationships have long conceptualized these connections as active emotional arenas where underlying unconscious dynamics continuously exchange emotional energy back and forth between two individuals across the years of contact. Within a typical narcissistic dynamic, this emotional energy exchange quickly becomes deeply skewed and painfully asymmetrical over the course of many long years together. One person in the pair unknowingly takes on the heavy role of an emotional regulator for the other, constantly adjusting their own behavior in order to manage the narcissist's unpredictable moods from one day to the next. As this familiar pattern repeats across many months and then many years, the narcissist learns to read emotional cues from that specific individual with astonishing sensitivity and quiet, almost unsettling accuracy. Consequently, when they encounter you again after a long, prolonged period of silent separation, their primary instinct is never to cultivate a genuine, healthy, emotional reconnection with you on equal personal terms. Their immediate reflexive instinct is to actively test whether that original asymmetric dynamic still quietly remains intact beneath the calm surface of your polite, measured greeting. They might open with a perfectly standard, unassuming conversational question, casually asking how you have been quietly doing lately or what you have been working on with your time. On the surface, it sounds like an ordinary polite inquiry that any friendly old acquaintance might reasonably ask after a long visible gap in contact between you. However, what they are truly evaluating internally in real time has absolutely nothing to do with the actual literal words of your spoken answer. They are listening intently for the underlying emotional resonance quietly hidden inside your brief reply. They want to hear clearly if you sound hesitant and unsure about how to answer their small question. They want to know if you seem overly eager to explain your recent life in unnecessary personal detail, as if quietly searching for their personal approval with every spoken sentence. They want to know if you appear to be quietly fishing for their personal validation right in the middle of your spoken answer to them. If your response carries even a minor trace of emotional investment in their personal opinion, even a faint hint of caring about how they personally see you, their internal equilibrium instantly restores itself to its previous comfortable, familiar level. The narcissist instinctively senses in that moment that the psychological door between you remains unlocked and ready to be pushed wide open by a confident hand. Their visible confidence smoothly returns to the polished surface of their persona, and their overall public demeanor often becomes overly familiar, faintly engaging, or even closely charming again within just a few short seconds. On the flip side of that same coin, if your response instead remains remarkably calm in tone, gently brief in length, and firmly emotionally neutral in its delivery, the psychological impact on them can be shockingly profound and extremely difficult for their nervous system to absorb comfortably on the spot.